The torchlight slammed into her like accusation. The torchlight slammed into her like accusation. Every gilded mirror in the Hall of Moons showed Lyra Halvorsen the same thing. An ornament too small for the throne beside her father. A shadow that made King Halvorsen's shoulders look broader, his jaws harder. Someone laughed. A silver cup tipped. Fingers pointed. Not of her face, but at the space she dared to occupy. Lyra felt her pulse in the hollow of her throat, the scar along her wrist burning as if the moon itself remembered what she was taught to hide. When she lifted her chin, the court saw only the crown on her father's head and the way his glare carved her into neat, obedient pieces. She had been schooled in making herself vanish. Tonight, the vanishing felt like a betrayal she could no longer swallow. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They expected her to leave the hall politely, to melt into the long stone corridors with the other diplomatic ornaments, blank-faced brides and veiled betroths. Instead, a human took a seat beside her. Jonah Maris moved as if the palace belonged to him, unhurried, steady, his sleeves rolled up past calloused wrists that had never held a sword. He did not bow to her father, did not offer the flattery the alphas traded like coin. He sat, relaxed, and when a serving girl stumbled past with a tray of spiced pheasant, he passed the plate to Lyra as if passing bread to an equal. His fingers brushed hers, brief, ordinary, and something in the hall misfired. The court quieted not from suspicion, but from a brittle, astonished silence that sounded a great deal like scandal. Lyra had been trained to expect derision from strangers, not kindness. She watched him for a moment, as one watches a moth tilt toward flame, and saw in Jonah's face no calculation, only curiosity and a careful kind of respect. He had the pale, honest eyes of someone who kept his life in ink and parchment rather than claws and territories. For an archivist, he was oddly present in the room, as if the library's lamplight had given him a different kind of armor. He asked no favors of the king, he neither flattered nor feared. When he asked softly if the pheasant was seasoned the way Lyra liked it, his voice carried no echo of the court's hunger. That small human courtesy was a blade. It split open something in Lyra that had been sutured down by lessons in silence. The court had taught her to shrink, to walk as if avoiding drafts, to let her hair fall over her face like a curtain, to smile only when molted and dull. Her slightness had been praised as humility, paraded like a virtue that proved her father's magnanimity. But Jonah's quiet attention named a word she had been taught to hide: worth.
He met her eyes and held them without the wince she expected for men who measured everything in muscle and bite. For the first time, another person did not avert gaze to write a treaty in their head. Jonah looked at her as if deciding whether the world might be better with her allowed to take up space. Her father noticed, of course. King Halvorsen's jaw was a landscape of storms, his legal hand curled around a goblet as though it were a weapon. He had orchestrated the Feast of Moons to remind every allied pack of his dominance, banners of wolfskin, the ritually carved moon plates, the alpha ranks stepping like black chess pieces. Lyra sat between those pieces like a mislaid pawn. It was not so much what Jonah was as what he represented, a loophole, a lever that rivals could exploit. If an unclaimed human could win favor with an alpha's blood, whispers could turn to rumors and rumors to fractures. For all the palace's opulence, politics here bent like iron under heat. Nothing was wasted, least of all a princess. Jonah's history was, on the surface, unassuming. He catalogued treaties in the municipal archive, a narrow, lamplit room outside the city where dust ghosted the air and ink faded the edges of memory. He was, by profession, a guardian of stories. He preserved the pack's past, lines of allegiance, names written in hand that trembled with the weight of centuries. He knew the words that made alliances binding and those that loosened them. The irony wasn't lost on Lyra. A man whose life was a ledger of promises was now quietly making one where it mattered most to her. He would not call it a vow. He would fold it into gentle conversation, into the steady way he met her eyes and offered bread. You could say the world had prepared them for each other in different ways. Lyra had been raised in a palace where demonstrations of power were routine, raised voices that carried teat in them, rituals of dominance where alphas bit into agreements and blood was the ink that sealed them. Her mother had been a quiet woman with wolf-gray hair and a face like a closed book, who taught Lyra in whispers to braid her hair tight and to keep her wrists hidden. The scar Lyra kept on her left wrist, a pale crescent that puckered the skin, was a secret map of a night when moonstruck and ashamed, she'd failed to hide a truth the court would have punished. That scar pulsed whenever the moon rose full. It reminded her that power could be both a gift and a verdict. How do you rule when everything you are taught is to acquiesce? Jonah had grown up with paper and ink and the belief that stories could be true or false depending on who wrote them. He had known rejection in another register, not of fangs and teeth, but of class and lineage. Humans in the border towns coexisted with the Lycans because trade and treaties made them practical.
Yet even in the markets, something like contempt hovered where the alphas passed, a look that said humans were useful but expendable. Jonah's own family had been erased from official accounts long ago. A name once recorded next to a line of wolf bloods had been scratched out, attributed to an unremarkable merchant. He carried that erasure like a ledger's missing line. When Jonah and Lyra first spoke properly, after the hall had resumed its ceremonies and the night wore on like a long, low drum, it was over a shared garden bench beyond the palace lanterns. The night smells of rosemary and damp stone, and when Lyra unknotted a tightness in her shoulders, Jonah did not ask to be entertained. He listened. He had doubts, small kindnesses that felt like rebellion, genuine questions about what she wanted, tentative admissions about his own sense of displacement. He told her, humorless and plain, about a treaty he had transcribed where the scribe had mistakenly listed the wrong boundary stone and how the error had almost led to war. Lyra laughed, a short, dislodged sound, and Jonah mapped the laugh like he mapped margins in a book, with a careful curiosity. That evening, small alliances began to form in pockets, whispered jokes, a gentle offering of a peeled apple, Lyra letting Jonah see the scar before she swore she would hide it. He did not flinch. He traced the pale crescent with a fingertip that trembled, not from fear, but something else, something like reverence. "You survived," he said, as if survival were a delicate craft. Lyra had always thought survival was rote, not heroic. The way Jonah framed it made her think survival could be a choice. But the palace remembers what it is taught to fear. News travels in the court like a favored hound, quick, scenting for weakness, rewarded for the right howl. At dawn, over clinking porridge and austere conversation, the first of the whispers reached Lyra, an echo via a cousin's wife face, a glance from a beta who had seen Jonah in the archives. They did not accuse Jonah outright, they only allowed the idea of him to gather into something like a threat. That morning, King Halverson called Lyra into his study, the room of maps and heavy curtains, and closed the door on easy sunlight. He spoke like a man reciting a litany of consequences. "An alliance must be clear," he said, and the words were convex, like a blade mirrored. "You are an asset, Lyra. The packs are watching for cracks. We will not hand weakness to our enemies." His hand hovered over a chart showing trading routes, marked with lines that pulsed like veins across the land. Jonah, an archivist, could be used to manipulate treaties. A human shaped into rumor could fracture a peace like wind through fragile parchment. The king's concern was not only strategic, it was a calculated fear of what the others might do if Lyra's sympathy shifted. Lyra felt the old habit clamp down, the reflex to shroud her face, to nod dutifully. But something in her tightened, not the practiced compliance, but a raw, unfamiliar nerve. "You would make me something to be given," she said, and the truth of the sentence tasted like rebellion. She imagined being set upon a pack leader's arm, her brief comfort turned into an exchange of power where she was the currency. She had spent 18 years learning how to be small, so his shadow would read as strength. Now that shadow felt like a cage. Her father's eyes narrowed, but behind the Alpha's command was a fear Lyra recognized, not of her choice, but of losing control. "Appearances, Lyra," he said. "We must govern perception. If you choose to—" He stopped, the words unfinished and therefore worse. The ultimatum hung in the air like a coiled wolf. If she chose to keep sitting beside a human, the king implied, alliances would demand recompense. Outside, the moon took its slow climb, indifferent to palace edicts. In the archive the next day, Jonah bent over brittle treaties and did not yet know the shape his life would take when court gossip found the margins of their shared moments. To him, Lyra was a person who tasted the same spice and preferred quiet pathways through the gardens. To Lyra, he had become an accident of tenderness in a world that measured value in bite and blood. Both of them were about to learn how porous those measurements could be. By the time the feast had cooled and the banners had been folded away, an impossible question had nested in Lyra like an uninvited guest. If the root of power in her world was the willingness to enforce it, what did it mean to choose differently? She had learned that love in her court was often a transaction, power transmuted into safety. But Jonah's presence suggested another language, one where being treated like a queen came without price other than being seen. Facing her father's maps and the sharp lines of his expectations, Lyra reached a decision point: obey and be treated like a treaty, or follow the extraordinary, precarious pull of a human who had sat beside her and looked at her as if she belonged to herself. The Hall of Maps closed its heavy curtains, but beyond them alliances shifted like weather. The first dilemma had taken its shape: stay the obedient daughter and secure a brittle peace, or risk everything for an unknown that might impossibly feel like home. Jonah found himself returning to the palace the way one returns to a book after a night's sleep, with the stubborn belief that the pages would still be there, the sentences intact. He told himself he was curious about the treaties and not about Lyra's laugh, but curiosity was a slipperier thing than he allowed. The archive had become an excuse. The real ink he wanted to read now was whatever script lay behind her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He had expected the palace to smell of metal and burn, but it smelled instead like wax and dust and the faint perfume that clung to Lyra's sleeve. Every time he catalogued a treaty, he thought of her asking whether the pheasant might have been overseasoned. He found himself annotating the margins of old agreements with tiny, private questions. How much of our past is left to us because someone took care to transcribe it? What is erased because someone... Every time he catalogued a treaty, he thought of her asking whether the pheasant might have been overseasoned. He found himself annotating the margins of old agreements with tiny, private questions. How much of our past is left to us because someone took care to transcribe it? What is erased because someone wants a simpler story? He was beginning to understand that the same hands that preserved law could also sculpt consent. Word had teeth here, and it gnawed at Jonah in the smallest ways. At the market, the fishmonger, an old man with a face like a folded map, stalled when Jonah mentioned he had been to the palace. "Careful, archivist," he said, lowering his voice. "Stories are sticky there." Jonah felt the word linger like a dust mote in the lamplight. Sticky. He had spent his life making what was fragile durable. Now he learned that durability itself could be dangerous. Lyra met him in the gardens as though every meeting were a contraband. She had taken to slipping away in the hours after midday, when the court's eyes were dulled by food and formalities. Night made alliances messy and private. Daylight turned them into currency. Their conversations, once easy and warm, had begun to sit on the edge of something like grief. The more she laughed, the more tightly she clenched her hands when a messenger crossed the garden. "You're quieter," Jonah said one afternoon, watching her braid a thin strand of rosemary into her hair. It was a small, domestic task that made her look like someone with less purpose and more possibility. The rosemary smelled like the sea to Jonah, an odd, bracing scent that cut through palace incense. Lyra smiled, but it was brittle. "My father's patience with recklessness is limited," she said. Words like recklessness were always used for other people, but in her mouth they felt like confession. "He calls me an asset or an ornament. Sometimes he phrases it as kindness." She tugged the rosemary tighter until it bit the skin at the nape of her neck. Jonah wanted to offer more than pity. He wanted to offer a strategy, some cunning plan he could execute with the same meticulousness he used to repair a torn treaty. Instead, he reached out and laid a hand on Lyra's, light, not possessive. "You don't have to be what they expect," he said. The simplicity of the sentence made her look at him as if he had given her a small, secret map. "But if I refuse to be that thing," her voice frayed, "what then? They will trade me. They will send me where convenience dictates." The rage in her was quiet and incandescent, the kind that might melt iron if released. "They will treat me as if I am a line item." Jonah's thumb stroking the inside of her wrist found the crescent of healed skin. He'd seen it before, the first night, and now he traced it again like a cartographer confirming a coastline. His own pulse stepped up in a response that was not all outrage and not all practical fear. He felt unmoored, as if the rules he had learned, work, preserve, do not make waves, no longer applied. "Then we make a new rule," he said, surprising himself. He imagined the small rebellion of a human voice saying that to power. It was almost absurd, but something like courage is often born of absurdity. While Lyra and Jonah floated in their private orbit, the court arranged for the one suitor who would most efficiently quiet gossip. Lord Kestrel Varen, a man whose jaw was as sharpened as his reputation. He arrived with a contingent of betas and a wolf-hide cloak that smelled faintly of iron and old blood. Kestrel's popularity in the provinces came from a simple formula: military victories and an appetite for authority. He had led raids that reminded neighboring packs why they made peace with Halvorsen. His offer of alliance had the blunt charm of a hammer. Kestrel eyed Lyra as the world's dignitaries might examine a map, a thing to be annexed. He smiled as if he were closing deals. When King Halvorsen announced, casually, that Kestrel would likely travel court rounds to negotiate a more formal match, the hall hummed with approval. For Lyra, the word likely felt like a chain being fastened. Jonah saw the announcement as an omen. He read Kestrel's name in the margins of treaties, where it appeared as a pledge to protect trade routes, protection often enforced by force. The thought of Lyra as part of Kestrel's life made Jonah's hands go cold. It wasn't only jealousy. He recognized the practicalities of alliance. The court was rarely sentimental. Kestrel offered security the way a knife offers a clean cut. If Lyra married him, she would be placed where she could no longer surprise anyone. He tried to speak to Halvorsen once, armed with the careful respect of a man accustomed to dealing with delicate documents. The king received him as one would any tributary, with a neutral nod that measured worth in usefulness. "You walk in many archives," Halvorsen said, as if testing a story by speaking it aloud. "You understand how narratives can be shaped." "I do," Jonah said. He felt foolish suddenly, like a child standing in front of a general pleading for mercy. "Your Grace, my place is small. I record things, I do not make claims, but I watched your daughter at the feast. He did not know how to say what he wanted. Words like queen felt presumptuous. Instead, he said plainly, "She deserves more than to be given." Halvorsen's face was stone, and then it was a map of carefully arranged thunder. "Lyra's advantages are not for her alone," he said. "They are leverage. We have enemies." The king's eyes were not unkind. They were simply honed. He did not understand, could not understand perhaps, the moral logic Jonah used when it came to people.
To Jonah, who had spent a life cataloging injustices that became accepted histories, Lyra's life felt like an error in transcription. Someone had misplaced a person in the margins and marked her as specimen when she was, in fact, a person. "You are an outsider," Halvorsen said, even as he invited Jonah to join them. "A human who chooses to step into our ceremonies. Be careful where you place your loyalties." The warning was a blade wrapped in etiquette. Jonah left the throne room feeling as if he wore a letter that was soon to be burned. He worried not only for himself, but for Lyra, who walked the palace corridors like a slim column holding up a roof that had no place for her preferences. In the days that followed, small cruelties multiplied like mold. A noblewoman suggested that Lyra should learn to bear more children. A general dismissed her silence as a sign of weak breeding. Kestrel's presence made the fortress of the court feel colder. He passed through the gardens with the inexorable tilt of one accustomed to being obeyed. Lyra's friends, few and chosen, began to distance themselves as if distance could be a shield. People who had smiled at her in the past, maids, a junior guard who once played chess with her in the servants' corridor, began to avoid her, or to offer only the safe, rehearsed kindnesses permissible to those under observation. She felt the walls incline, closing the world into more transactional angles. She began to doubt the small mercies she had seen in Jonah. Were they simply illusions, short-lived as reflections in a goblet? One night, while the moon hung like a watchful eye over the palace, Jonah found a treaty in the archive that was misfiled. A scribe had tucked into a ledger a short paragraph of names of humans bound in centuries-old oaths with the wolves. Jonah's breath caught. The ink had been smudged and then cleverly rewritten. A name once clearly recorded had been scratched away. He felt a current in his chest as if a seam had been torn open. The erased line was a discovery that could have been a whisper. Jonah read the smudge until the letters resolved into suggestion. The treaty hinted at a human line called the Marsbind, a covenant in which humans and wolves once swore mutual protection, a binding that made humans wardens of borders in exchange for land and lawful status. The line's benefits had been systematically reattributed to wolves in the public record. Mars had been relegated to merchant folk in the margins. If anyone noticed, the consequences could be disruptive. A human claim to rights based on ancient oaths could upset the neat architecture of power. Jonah's hands shook as he realized what this meant for him. He had always thought his family's name had simply faded into obscurity, a merchant lineage absorbed into another. But the smudged ink suggested something deliberate, a removal.
He closed the ledger carefully, like someone who had seen a human face peeking from an old wood-paneled door. His pulse calmed into a plan's rhythm. He would not rush to Lyra with accusations. The archive had taught him discretion. But he also could not ignore the knowledge. The existence of those bindings meant he had more claim to history than anyone at court had allowed. When he told Lyra about the treaty, choosing a twilight bench just beyond the vine-trellised wall, her reaction was a flicker of hope and a hardening of resolve. The idea that his lineage might be anchored in a legal rope that had been frayed and cut was perversely both threat and solace. If Jonah's family had once held a place in treaty, that could be used as a slur against them or as evidence of a right no one wanted acknowledged. This could be exploited, Lyra said. She imagined the court plotting. If Jonah had a claim, they could spin it into scandal. Or it could be weaponized as a reason to claim you. Jonah looked at her. He tried to imagine being used as a stratagem in the chess game of marriage and territory. The thought made the blood in his ears pulse disloyally. "Then we do not tell them," he said. "We keep what is useful, what is truthful, in our own hands." The plan was both brave and stupid. Keeping the treaty hidden felt like hoarding a truth, but the alternative was to hand it straight into the machinery of power that would grind it into a tool. They made a pact of sorts in the hedgelight: silence toward those who would weaponize their connection, stubborn companionship toward those who offered no more than convenience. It felt heroic and delicate, but secrets, like bad weather, have a way of arriving without invitation. Rumors started to unfurl, not from what they had said, but from what they had not said. A guard was overheard joking that the princess had been seen in the company of a bookish scribe. A junior poet at court composed a satire that hinted at a union between a noblewoman and a low-born archivist, and it slipped into the wrong hands. The satire, meant as comedy, became a salacious shorthand for moral laxity. Kestrel's camp circulated the piece with the relish of predators who sharpened gossip into weapons. Lyra's presence at the feast, Jonah's unacknowledged place beside her, the smudged treaty in Jonah's hands, these were the pieces others could arrange into a story that suited them. Lyra's father shifted like a man adjusting to a storm. He tightened the spaces Lyra could occupy, asked now for her attendance at public functions as if more exposure would normalize the idea that she could be presented and traded. He did not know the exact origins of the satire, only that it served a useful purpose. He told Lyra, gently and then not gently, that she must comply with the traditions that had kept Halverson power intact for generations. Inside Lyra, something that had been damped to embers stoked into flame. She imagined a future where her likeness hung in foreign halls as proof that Halverson had honored an agreement. She imagined Jonah in the margins of some alliance as a footnote. The idea of being appended like a clause in a treaty made her sick. She reached for a decision that felt like both folly and clarity. "I cannot be inventory," she told him one night, the moon carving silver along the palace stones. "If they will arrange me for the sake of appearances, I will not be their exhibit." Jonah's reply was a taut, honest silence. He had promised himself practicality, had promised to preserve and catalog, and not to be silly with big emotions. She imagined a future where her likeness hung in foreign halls as proof that Halverson had honored an agreement. She imagined Jonah in the margins of some alliance as a footnote. The idea of being appended like a clause in a treaty made her sick. She reached for a decision that felt like both folly and clarity. "I cannot be inventory," she told him one night, the moon carving silver along the palace stones. "If they will arrange me for the sake of appearances, I will not be their exhibit." Jonah's reply was a taut, honest silence. He had promised himself practicality, had promised to preserve and catalog, and not to be silly with big emotions. But seeing Lyra poised at a precipice with dignity like a fragile flag made him reckless. "Then we stand against it," he said. "Not with war, for that is beyond our means, but with truth where we can place it, with stubbornness, with living an ordinary life in the face of their expectations." Lyra let out a small, indrawn laugh that was part courage and part terror. They both understood the limitations of their promise. Standing together in the face of court derision would not stop Kestrel's designs, nor would it erase the king's need for alliances. It might, however, be enough to keep Lyra from being traded in the dark theater of political expedience. They began to occupy their small rebellions like a second skin, Jonah taking extra visits to the markets to remind traders of their shared histories, Lyra skipping certain functions to meet commoners who lived at the margins of the kingdom, women who bore children and kept the granaries, men whose hands were calloused with honest labor. Each meeting was a stitch.
Each moment of ordinary connection was a counter-argument to the court's calculus. But the world is not content with small rebellions. An emissary arrived from a rival pack to negotiate the exchange of a border forfeiture document, an old score that Halverson had called settled years before. The emissary was a lean, dark-eyed man with a smile like a blade's reflection. He was curious about Lyra, about whether Halverson had any available daughters to be married into calmer borders. He did not ask outright. He never needed to. The tone of his interest was invitation enough. Lyra watched him with a calm she did not feel. She sat at the dais during the meeting, a polite presence, and felt the weight of her father's expectation as a physical thing. Jonah, standing in the background with his ledger, tried to appear ordinary and appeared instead like someone whose skin had been tacked to a board for public inspection. As the emissary's gaze lingered on Lyra, Jonah realized they were not merely spectators, they were pieces. He had, in his search through treaties, found evidence of a past where humans had been more than background. He understood now that uncovering history could protect them, but it could also endanger the fragile consensus Halverson had cultivated.
Standing beside Lyra, in the scent of oil lamps and dust, he felt for the first time the sting of being a variable in others' games. The tension at court grew like a bruise. It darkened the palette of their days. Each smile felt like a negotiation. Each conversation was a potential spark. And every time the moon rose full and flushed the night with its white light, Lyra's wrist would throb with the memory of a truth she had been told to hide. The ache was now a rallying cry. She would have to choose whether to continue being a shadow to make her father look taller, or to stand, small and dangerous, beside a human who had the audacity to sit like she was a queen. A storm was forming along the edges of their lives, political, personal, inevitable. Each small rebellion drew a line. Each secret discovery widened the fissure. And at the center of it all, Lyra and Jonah found themselves pushed toward a decision that would not be theirs alone to make. The first blow came not with teeth, but with a parchment folded into someone else's hand. It arrived at dawn, a courier from a minor lord in the north, face flushed with the certainty of rumor, and he handed Lyra an anonymous letter in the shadow of the palace stables, as if dropping a thing the wind had brought. The script inside was neat and cruel. Jonah Maris had a claim, the letter said, to antiquated rights. He was the descendant of Maris Bind, a human line once bound to wolves. The letter invited speculation, adding a single venomous suggestion. What if the princess was in love with a man whose past could undo treaties? Lyra felt the world tilt. Her first movement was to find Jonah. Her second was to hide the letter in the braid of rosemary at her belt, because there was something obscene about letting paper decide people's lives. When she found him in the archive, bent over a ledger as if he could make sense of fate by running his finger through its ink, she did not speak. The sight of him, so calm, so absurdly ordinary, made her feel both foolish and incandescently alive. She wanted to throw the letter on the table and make him read the world's greed out loud. Instead, she simply pushed a chair across from him and sat. "What is it?" Jonah asked, eyes already softening into concern. She gave him the paper. His face changed while he read. Lines he had traced on treaties within the safety of margins hardened into something almost feral. "I thought I could keep it," he said quietly. "I thought if I never told anyone, it would stay a fact on paper and not a lever in their mouths." The admission cracked everything. Lyra, who had spent years learning how to bite down on her own desires to keep her father's reign unassailable, felt betrayed by the ease with which truth became a weapon. "You kept it from me," she said, the sentence like a latch thrown open on a fear she had tried to smother. "You kept your name from me." Jonah flinched, as if she had struck him.
He reached for the letter and crumbled it, more at his own guilt than at the words. "I wanted to protect." He reached for the letter and crumbled it, more at his own guilt than at the words. "I wanted to protect you." Protect me from what? From knowing who stands beside me? Her voice shook, not with anger alone, but with the raw hurt of being used as a reality test for someone else's cowardice. "Do you think I would be safer ignorant?" He closed his eyes. "I thought I could prevent you from being traded because of me. I thought secrecy would be a shield." The shield, once lifted, revealed that secrecy had been a choice that kept them from consenting together.
Love had become a private negotiation in which one had bargained without the other's knowledge. Lyra had vowed to own herself. Jonah had tried to spare her. Both moves were tender and selfish at once. The fracture was a slow internal avalanche. Word, once fed a scent, spreads faster than a firebrand through old linen. Someone, Kestrel perhaps, or a courtier who liked the taste of mischief, took the anonymous letter and made it article and accusation. The satire poet's verses were reprinted with marginal notes. Servants whispered about the archivist who had been born of human oaths. The rumor mill had wheels greased by ambition. King Halvorsen, who had always known how to turn fear into strategy, felt betrayed not only by the possibility of a murky bond between his daughter and a human, but by Jonah's concealment. To an alpha, secrecy within the palace was always a potential knife. The first public fracture was mechanical and cruel. At dinner that week, Halvorsen stood and announced that Jonah Maris would be placed under investigation. An old law allowed the king to order a review of any human whose status could influence treaties. Jonah was to be detained until the truth of his lineage could be confirmed. Halvorsen used the phrase, "for the kingdom's safety," and the court applauded the language that turned threat into duty. Lyra's protest was a small thing in a great room. A hand raised, the plea in her voice like a candle fighting a storm. "You can't do this. He's done nothing." "You were seen with him," the king said, his voice a blade dulled by will. A princess cannot be carelessly associated with unverified claims. It provokes other leaders. It provokes enemies. Lyra wanted to scream that the world was not a ledger item to be filed under provocation, but the king's decision had become a fact. Jonah was escorted away by guards who were polite and resolute in a single motion, the sort of courtesy that makes cruelty tolerable. Lyra followed as far as the archive's threshold, where Jonah paused and turned to look at her. The expression on his face was a map of apology and defeat. "I am sorry," he mouthed, which to Lyra sounded like an admission that he had already accepted his sacrifice. He was taken to a small locked room in the eastern wing, a place where the palace stored inconvenient objects.
The inquiry that followed was a theater of polite questions, names, dates, records. Officials read from ledgers with a practiced lack of curiosity. But Halvorsen's order had the weight to reshape narratives. Those who wanted to erase the Marisbind found in the king's mandate an alibi to do so. While Jonah was detained, the palace erupted with strategic rearrangements. Kestrel moved closer in the public choreography, offering a solution for Lyra's future that looked dangerously like annexation. He promised stability, a union that would neutralize gossip. He smiled in ways that made the guards in the hall tighten their grips on their halberds. Politicians, feeling the breeze of advantage, gathered like flies. Lyra felt the palace collapse into a room full of clocks, each one ticking in a different time zone. The people she had thought allies, cousins of indeterminate loyalty, servants who benefited from being near power, showed their true calculations. A woman who had been a friend since girlhood, a gentle presence named Ellen, avoided Lyra's glances. "They told me to be careful," she said once, eyes shying away as if the truth itself might be contagious. "I can't be seen to—" "To what?" Lyra demanded, the phrase unfinished and therefore worse. "To love the wrong person? To be human?" Ellen's silence answered like a verdict. Loyalty in the court was rewarded when it mirrored the king's will, otherwise it was punished by absence. The loneliness that had once been a soft thing now stung like salt. Jonah, for his part, learned brutality in administrative form. The investigation delved into parish registries and forgotten oaths, and as he watched his family's name be reinterpreted into the annals of something smaller, he felt the old ache of erasure rage anew. The Marisbind that he had stumbled upon, something that had once implied mutuality, was being refashioned into a liability, a past to be hidden. When he was finally brought before the council, the air felt as if it had been vacuumed of oxygen. Accusations were coded in legality. "Your line," one counselor said with a smile as white as bone, "possesses implications for border claims. You should have declared your status to the crown." "And if I had," Jonah replied, voice steady but small, "I would have been used to secure alliances I would never consent to." The sentiment was honest and naive in a world that preferred to be practical. Halvorsen listened with the kind of stillness that is cultivated over decades of command. He regarded Jonah as a fact to be catalogued, like a ledger line that required verification.
You kept information that could have reshaped negotiations, he said. You made your own narrative. Lyra stood. She had not been invited to speak at the council. She would have been dismissed for it. But she had a certain stubbornness that did not accept being shaped by others. You have all these words for me, she said.
You speak of leverage and alliances, but you never asked me what I wanted. You stripped me of voice in the same breath you demanded my compliance. Her defiance pleased no one and alarmed them all. Halverson's eyes darkened in a way that had nothing to do with familial tenderness. This is not about you, he replied. It is about the realm's safety. You use the realm as a shield for what you cannot admit, she shot back. You taught me to small myself so your shadow would look larger, but I am not a shadow. The council closed ranks. Words like reckless and dangerous were lobbed like shells. A nobleman with teeth like coins suggested that Lyra's protests were the product of an unsuitable intimacy and therefore a threat to stability. His insinuation landed as if someone had flung a stone into the private pond they had been making together. The fracture between Lyra and the court widened into a chasm. Jonah's detention hardened into punishment. He was exiled to a border archive underguard, forced to take his knowledge away from the palace and into a place where the river of power was shallower. The decision was legal, neat, and cruelly effective. To the court, they had done what needed to be done, removed a variable, demonstrated prudence. To Lyra, it felt like betrayal from the only people who should have protected her right to choose. She had loved with a stubbornness that assumed reciprocity. Jonah had protected her from public scandal without asking if she wished to be spared. The result was a public unraveling of trust on both sides. She had been denied the right to make peace and hurting for a man who had tried, in his own way, to prevent harm. When Jonah left the palace, he did so under escort with his head high, as if honor alone could keep his dignity intact. He reached for Lyra at the threshold, fingers brushing hers in a small, searing goodbye. "I am sorry," he said again, and the words were a benediction and a wound. Lyra watched the carriage take him away, and something in her folded into a narrower shape. The palace felt larger and lonelier now. Every room spoke of compromise and cost. The king's maps, once a relief for their clarity, now looked like nets. That night, Lyra walked to the highest battlement and leaned on the stone, feeling the moon's indifferent gaze on the scar that had started this whole unspooling. It pulsed like a small animal. She thought of the Marispind, of how a line scratched out in ink could erase a people. She thought of Jonah's hands, which had held pages, not swords, and how those hands had steadied her in the Hall of Moons. Betrayal, she learned, is not only the act of deception, but also the omission of a shared life. Jonah had tried to protect. She had wanted to share. In the space between those motives, the court found its advantage and sharpened it into an exile.
Outside, somewhere in the village where traders hummed and the sea pressed against the cliffs, Jonah rode toward a border library that would become his prison. He would spend days cataloging ancient treaties and nights replaying Lyra's laugh. He would, in his solitude, understand the cost of omission and the price of courage. Lyra, within the palace, would learn the ways power demands sacrifice and the particular cruelty it can inflict on those who crave nothing more than to be seen. A fracture had opened between them, made of secrecy, politics, and the weight of a kingdom's appetite. It throbbed like a wound both could not pretend not to feel. In that aching space, the court rearranged itself, lines redrawn and alliances rewritten. The scandal that had been whispered for sport now had teeth, and the teeth bit both of them in ways that would not be easily sutured. Secrets, once revealed, had a way of breaking more than trust. They broke the pattern of small consolations both had built. As the moon tracked its patient arc across the sky, Lyra and Jonah learned the most piercing truth of all, that love could be an act of rebellion and also an instrument of collateral damage. They had both attempted to protect the other from different dangers, and in their failures, the kingdom found new leverage. The fracture was complete, not a single clean break, but a jagged line that would influence everything to come. The first time Lyra moved without asking permission, the moon was a low coin smelted into the sky. She did not wait for counsel or counsel's permission. She slipped into her father's map room, gathered the smallest of maps,
those the king used for border patrols, and folded them into the pockets of her cloak. Ellen met her at the stables with a horse that snorted like it knew there was mischief afoot. The friend who had learned cautious politeness now learned the taste of courage, and her hands trembled as she handed Lyra a coil of rope. "If we are caught," Ellen whispered, "do not say I came." Lyra kissed her forehead anyway. It felt like a benediction and a theft in equal measure. Jonah had been moved further than she knew, exiled to a border archive crammed against the cold sea, a place where wind-splintered documents were kept under the watch of men who trusted stone more than people. Lyra had memorized the route from the parchment she tucked into her sleeve, and the names of the wards where his escort might slacken. She had no plan beyond the word that had been shaping her since he'd been taken: choice. They rode under a moon that painted the world silver and revealed shadows as sharp as knives. At the archive, guards drowsed where their charges allowed it. Officials grow complacent when legality becomes weaponized. Lyra's breath found its rhythm in the cold. She had been trained to be small. She had learned to braid silence into a protective rope. Now she braided rebellion.
With Ellen and 2 servants who owed her more than they would admit, people she had quietly helped while the court watched, she slipped into the building like ink into old parchment. The rescue was clean, until it wasn't. A sentry turned, the soft scuff of a boot catching Ellen's breath. Metal flashed. Jonah, who had been asleep over a ledger's table, woke barefoot and bewildered. He reached for a quill and found instead Lyra's hand, calloused, urgent, not ornamental, and the sight of it steadied him. "We don't have time for speeches," Lyra hissed, and his laugh at her bluntness cut through the fear like a rope through fog. He rose, pulling a shawl about his shoulders, and for a heartbeat they were 2 people stealing moments in a crowded world, small thieves of each other's futures. A shout turned the light loud. Kestrel's patrol had been tipped, or perhaps the tide had shifted and made opportunity out of vigilance. Guards poured into the archive like a white tide. The servant with the rope clattered, a chain of iron singing as it hit stone. Ellen shoved Lyra and Jonah through a narrow side door that led toward a cliff path. The sea beyond beat slow and relentless. They ran with the awkward, earnest speed of those who have never been soldiers. A thrown spear cut the earth where they had been, and Jonah, in an attempt to shield Lyra from a swinging halberd, took the brunt of a glancing blow across his side. The wound was not mortal, but it was honest, spilling dark, astringent warmth across linen he had never thought to protect. Lyra's fingers found the cut, and the first thing she did was press, because she had seen too many things stitched away by men who thought authority meant erasure. Jonah's face went slack with a laugh that might have been pain or relief. "You always were dramatic," he gasped. "I am not leaving you," she said, and the words were small but stern as an oath. She bit down on the cloth, fashioning a tourniquet with a practiced hand she had never admitted to learning from the healer across the gardens. He squeezed her fingers. The pressure was apology and acceptance braided into one. They reached a cove where Ellen had stashed a fisher's skiff. The sea smelled of iron and wild things. As they pushed off, the palace torches flared on the cliff, an announcement of failure for some, a challenge for others. Lyra cradled Jonah against her, listening to the catch of his breath like a drum keeping a secret rhythm. He was losing blood, yes, but he also held her with a steadier, fiercer grip than any ring or crown had ever demanded. They were not yet safe. Kestrel's men had not given up, and the shallow reef forced the skiff to skirt the rocks where waves could crush flimsy hope. Lyra's hands were salt-sour from the sea. Jonah's pulse was a fragile, honest thing. She found herself thinking of maps and treaties, and of how both men and ink could be violent.
Here, in a boat on an angry sea, she found the red line. Here, in a boat on an angry sea, she found the red line of action. She would not be traded, and she would not trade his life for the court's prudence. When at last they reached a hidden inlet where an old keeper of fishermen, one of the small people Lyra had quietly befriended, waited with bandages and a stoic face, Jonah's eyes opened fully and found her. "Why?" he asked, voice thin but steady. Lyra's answer was not a speech, but a small, decisive thing. She leaned in and kissed him, urgent, fierce, a breaking of rules that had been strangling them both. The kiss tasted of sea salt and adrenaline, of a palace corridor where she had first learned to hide, and a ledger where his family name had almost been erased. It was a claim and a confession, the kind that rewrites treaties by being itself. "You are my choice," she whispered when they parted. "You are not a lever. You are not a mistake." He smiled into the heat of her face. "Then let us be inconvenient," he said, and the word felt like a vow. They stayed that night in the fisher's cottage, Jonah tended by rough hands and Lyra sleepless with planning. Dawn leaked gray over the water,
and with it came the hard necessity of consequence. They could not hide forever. The court would rally. Kestrel would parade offers like mercy. Halvorsen would brand them both as problems to be solved. But Lyra had learned something in the archive, in the small betrayals and the large ones. Power falters when it cannot define the people it governs. She would not accept being an annotation in her father's ledger. Jonah's wound and their theft of one another's lives made that clear. If she had to stand before the king with her hair unbraided and her scar bared like a flag, she would. If Jonah had to stand beside her, bandage still stained with a night of blood, then so be it. They would be spectacle if they must, but they would be spectacle that spoke truth. The sacrifice Jonah had made by taking the wound, by being the one to bear the physical cost, had not been planned, but it became sacred. It changed the algebra of their fight. It was no longer just Lyra's rebellion against being traded. It was both of them, wounded and wild and claiming one another on their own terms. The sea outside the cottage hammered quietly, as if applauding the small enormity of ordinary people choosing one another against the world. When they returned to the capital under a sky rubbed raw with dawn, they did not come as fugitives. They came as argument. Lyra riding in with her cloak open to show the scar on her wrist, a small defiant crescent, and Jonah walking beside her, bandage dark at his side, but head held high. The palace gates swung open because courtiers could not refuse a procession. News, once it had form, became impossible to ignore. At the threshold of the throne room, Lyra stopped and turned to face the man who had taught her how to vanish into background, and then tried to make her into a commodity.
King Halvorsen's jaw worked. He had meant to demonstrate prudence, and instead his kingdom now witnessed a princess who had stolen a man from a locked room and returned with his blood on her hands. It was an image hard to file into any neat treaty. Father and daughter stood a breath apart, histories and betrayals layered between them. Lyra felt the scar throb as if the moon itself were making a mark. She could have negotiated, she could have resumed the rituals that kept Halvorsen unthreatened. Instead, she stepped forward and offered no words of appeasement. She laid her hand on Jonah's bandaged side where the wound had been, a small public touch that carried the weight of the night's voyage. "My father," she said, voice steady as a hammered nail, "I was not given away, I chose. He is not a lever to be moved across your maps." The king's face shifted not into fury, but into the brittle mask of a man weighing losses. Kingdoms were measured in edges, and Lyra had made a jagged one. Halvorsen could have had her arrested. He could have insisted on a public humiliation that would have made the rest of the packs nod in approval. Instead, he surprised them all. He looked at Jonah, at the bandage, at the honest, blameless face of the archivist, and then at Lyra, the small ruler who had refused to be small. The king's voice, when it came, was not the roar it used against enemies, but a worn, careful thing. "You have broken my rules," he said. "You have embarrassed alliances. You have made compromises difficult." Lyra's hands did not shake. "I have also saved a man who refused to be erased," she answered. "If your alliances cannot survive an honest choice, then they were never alliances at all." For a long breath, the palace held its motion. Then, in a silence that felt like a verdict made of winter light, Halvorsen lowered his eyes, and with the slow, reluctant grace of a man learning to bend, he offered a concession. Jonah would be reviewed not as a threat, but as a person, and Lyra's future would not be decided without her presence at the table. It was not full victory. Kestrel's supporters hissed like unsettled wolves. Jokers in the court painted their displeasure as wisdom, but it was reclamation, small, fragile, and entirely theirs. Jonah's wound would leave a faint line at his side. Lyra's scar would shimmer as a reminder that some truths cannot be hidden by protocol. Their hands found each other in the open, a tacit, stubborn union. Redemption had arrived not as a tidy absolution, but as a public reclamation. Lyra had risked the crown of her security, and Jonah had bled for a choice he had once tried to keep secret. The palace watched them and was forced to attend to reality, a dangerous, beautiful thing when it refuses to be what others insist it must be.
Outside, the moon watched on, patient, indifferent, and witnessed a different kind of pact. Two people, injured and determined, who had chosen each other with all the reckless dignity of people who will not be traded. The court relented in small, necessary ways. Jonah was recognized as a man, not a footnote. Lyra's voice was finally a vote. Kestrel sulked into quieter ambitions. Ellen returned with a steadier step. Old maps were amended, not to erase history, but to include it.
Lyra and Jonah did not triumph by bloodletting, but by showing the kingdom how daring tenderness could be, a quieter power that unstitched harsh certainties. On the palace battlement, they watched a new moon rise together, hands clasped, scars catching the first pale light, proof that whatever world ruled by fangs or ink, love could redraw its lines.